Alexander Reid was a man who thrived on control. As the CEO of a powerful investment firm in New York City, he was used to making split-second decisions that could shift markets. His life was fast-paced, his time meticulously scheduled, and emotions were a luxury he couldn't afford. That's why, on a sweltering summer afternoon, he didn't expect a street vendor to throw his well-ordered world into disarray. It was one of those relentless July days where the heat pressed down like an iron weight. Alexander had just left a high-profile meeting and was driving down a crowded Manhattan Avenue when something unusual caught his attention. A young woman stood at the street corner, calling out with the confidence of a seasoned salesperson. "Cold water. Just $2. Stay cool, folks, perfect for this heat." Her voice carried over the noise of honking taxis and hurried pedestrians. She wasn't just selling water, she was selling survival, determination, and resilience. Alexander watched as a man in a business suit, a man much like himself, approached her stand. He grabbed a bottle from the cooler, twisted off the cap, and took a long gulp before frowning. $2? Are you kidding me? I could get this for half the price at the store. The young woman didn't flinch. She crossed her arms and looked him straight in the eye. "Then go to the store," she shot back. "But unless you're about to spit that water back into the bottle, you owe me $2. A few bystanders chuckled, enjoying the confrontation. The businessman's face turned red. He grumbled something under his breath, crumpled up a bill, and tossed it on the table before storming off. Alexander was intrigued. He had seen countless people desperate to make a sale, willing to bow and scrape for a few extra dollars. But not her. This woman stood her ground. He parked his sleek black sedan a few feet away and stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. As he approached the stand, the woman glanced up at him. Unlike most people, she didn't look intimidated. Instead, she arched an eyebrow. "You thirsty, or are you just here to watch the show?" she asked, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. Alexander studied her. Her t-shirt was faded, her jeans slightly frayed, but there was something about the way she carried herself, bold, unyielding, unafraid. "How many bottles do you have?" he asked. The woman hesitated. "Why?" "I want to buy them all." Her eyes narrowed. "All of them?" Without another word, Alexander pulled a $100 bill from his wallet and placed it on the table. "Let me know if you need change." She crossed her arms. Trying to impress someone, she challenged. "Because if that's the case, don't bother. I already think you're weird." A rare smile tugged at the corner of Alexander's lips. "Let's just say I appreciate a good investment." "Oh, so now water is an investment," she said, folding her arms. "Guess I missed that memo." He met her gaze evenly. "You negotiate well. You don't back down. That's rare." She studied him for a moment. "Right," she said finally. "But that still doesn't explain why a guy in a suit is dropping $100 on street water." Alexander didn't answer. Instead, he simply picked up the bottles, one by one, and carried them to his car. The woman squinted at him. "Wait, you're actually taking them all?" "That was the deal, wasn't it?" "Well, yeah, but this still seems really suspicious." Alexander paused, turned back to her, and said, "Maybe I just want to help." She scoffed. "If that's the case, save your money. I don't take handouts." His blue eyes studied her for a long moment before he replied, "It's not a handout. I pay for what something is worth. And your time is worth a lot more than $2 a bottle." For the first time, she looked unsure. "Well, if you want to waste your money," she finally muttered, stuffing the bill into her pocket. "I won't stop you." Alexander placed the last of the bottles in his car, then turned back to her. "See you around, vendor." She frowned. "If you need more water, you know where to find me." Alexander gave a small, knowing smile. He got into his car and drove away, but as he navigated through the busy streets, his mind lingered on the woman he had just met. For the first time in years, something had managed to pull his thoughts away from business. And he had a feeling this wasn't going to be the last time he crossed paths with her. Alexander Reid was not a man who acted on impulse. His entire life had been built on precision, strategy, and control. But ever since his unusual encounter with the water vendor on that sweltering afternoon, she had remained on his mind, an unexpected and persistent thought that refused to be pushed aside. Her defiance, her resilience, and the way she stood her ground had intrigued him. He had met countless people in the corporate world, people who bent over backward to please him, who chose their words carefully to stay in his good graces. But Luna Hayes? She didn't care who he was. She didn't care about his money or his influence. And that made her unforgettable. That evening, as he sat in his penthouse apartment high above the city, he found himself thinking about her again. It was ridiculous. She was just a girl selling water on a street corner. He had more important things to worry about: business deals, stock markets, billion-dollar investments. And yet, the next morning, he found himself back on that same street. Luna was there, just as he had imagined. The sun was already bearing down, and she was arranging bottles in her cooler, calling out to passing pedestrians with the same energy as before. "Cold water. Just $2. Don't let this heat get to you." Alexander stood at a distance, watching. She worked with efficiency, engaging every potential customer with a smile and a persistence that was almost admirable. If they ignored her, she simply shrugged and moved on to the next. If they hesitated, she convinced them. If they complained about the price, she challenged them. She wasn't just selling water, she was selling determination. Finally, after observing long enough, he walked toward her stand. Luna noticed him instantly. She paused, hands on her hips, and let out a small, amused sigh. Well, she said, crossing her arms. "The eccentric millionaire is back." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "I have a name, you know." "That's great. So tell me, Alexander, are you here to buy more water?" He glanced at the cooler filled with bottles before looking back at her. "Maybe." Luna narrowed her eyes. "Maybe? So you're not here because of the heat?" He kept his expression unreadable. "Let's just say I was curious." She let out a short laugh. "Didn't know millionaires were interested in street vendors." "You seem different," he said simply. "And you seem like a man who doesn't take no for an answer." Alexander smirked slightly. "Did I hit a nerve?" Luna shook her head, clearly unfazed. "Do you always just show up in people's lives like this?" He shrugged. "Only when something catches my attention." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to figure out his angle. Then, with a slight shake of her head, she reached into the cooler and pulled out a bottle. "So, Mr. Curious," she said, holding it up. "Are you buying or not?" Alexander took the bottle, but instead of immediately pulling it from her hand, he met her gaze and held it. "Do you think I'm eccentric for buying all your water yesterday?" She didn't hesitate. "I do." "Then what's stopping me from doing it again?" Luna pulled the bottle back slightly. "Me?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. "You?" She nodded. "I don't want you to buy everything. I sell water to survive, not so some rich guy can throw money at me for no reason." He was silent for a moment, considering her words. Then, without another word, he pulled out his wallet and handed her a $20 bill. "Keep the change," he said. Luna hesitated before taking it. But as she did, she frowned slightly. "If you think you can buy me, you're wrong." Alexander didn't respond right away. He just opened the bottle, took a sip, and then wiped his lips before looking at her again. "See you around, seller." He turned and walked back to his car, leaving Luna standing there, gripping the bill in her hand. She couldn't explain it, but something about that man unsettled her. And for the first time in a long while, she found herself thinking about someone more than she wanted to. Alexander Reid had never been the kind of man to get involved in someone else's struggles. In the world of high finance, emotions were a liability. He had built his empire by making calculated decisions, not by following impulses. Yet here he was, sitting in his corner office, staring out over the Manhattan skyline, his mind not on billion-dollar deals, but on a stubborn street vendor who refused to take an easy way out. Luna Hayes. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. She had a pride that bordered on defiance, a determination that made her stand out. He had seen wealthy executives crumble under his presence, yet she had met him head-on, unafraid and unimpressed. And she was struggling. A simple search had told him what she would never admit: Luna was barely scraping by. She was behind on her tuition payments at the university, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. The water stand was just one piece of the puzzle. At night, she worked long shifts at a local restaurant, barely getting enough rest before repeating the exhausting cycle. Alexander had more money than he could ever spend in a lifetime. To him, a few $1,000s were nothing. To her, they could mean the difference between staying in school or dropping out. He didn't need to think twice. The next morning, an anonymous payment was made to Luna's university account. Every outstanding balance, every overdue fee, gone. But he didn't stop there. A quiet conversation with the right people ensured that Luna's workplace would soon see a management change. He had no intention of controlling her life, but he had learned that her boss at the restaurant was an arrogant, dismissive man who overworked his employees and treated them poorly. That didn't sit well with Alexander. Within a week, the restaurant had a new manager, a fair, respectable man who valued his staff. Luna, of course, knew nothing of this. She continued working just as hard, convinced that the sudden shift in fortune was either a coincidence or sheer luck. But her world came crashing down the day she visited the university's administration office to discuss a payment plan. "I know I'm behind," she said, gripping the strap of her bag. "But I just need a little more time. I'll pay it, I promise." The woman behind the desk smiled at her. "Miss Hayes, your balance has been cleared." Luna blinked. "What?" "The full amount was paid earlier this week. Your account is current." She felt her heart pound. That was impossible. She hadn't made any payments. No one she knew had that kind of money to help her. And then it hit her. No. It couldn't be. Furious, she stormed out of the office, her pulse racing. She didn't even stop to think, she just knew she had to confront him. By the time she reached the towering building of Reid Enterprises, she barely noticed the sleek glass doors, the well-dressed employees who moved with purpose. She was too angry. The receptionist looked up, startled. "Miss, do you have an appointment?" "He's expecting me," Luna lied, marching past the desk. Of course, he wasn't. But she didn't care. It wasn't long before word reached Alexander. He was in a meeting when one of his assistants whispered in his ear, "Sir, there's a young woman in the lobby demanding to see you." Luna Hayes. Alexander smiled slightly. Of course, she wouldn't just let it go. Send her up. When Luna entered his office, she didn't hesitate. She slammed the door behind her and crossed her arms. You paid my tuition. Alexander remained calm. Good morning to you, too. Don't do that, she snapped. Don't act like this is nothing. I don't think it's nothing, he said, leaning back in his chair. I think it's important. She clenched her fists. I didn't ask you to do that. I know. Then why? Alexander studied her for a moment before answering. Because I wanted to. Luna's jaw tightened. That was the same thing he had said when he bought all her water. This isn't right, she said, shaking her head. What's not right? He asked. The fact that you don't have to worry about dropping out of school? The fact that you can focus on your future instead of struggling just to stay afloat? I would have figured it out, she insisted. I don't doubt that, Alexander said. But now you don't have to. Luna was speechless. She wanted to argue, to yell, to make him understand that she didn't need his charity. But deep down, she knew the truth. She did need the help. She just didn't want to need him. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself. This doesn't change anything. Alexander stood and took a slow step toward her. I never expected it to. Their eyes locked. For the first time, Luna saw something in his gaze that wasn't arrogance or amusement. It was sincerity. And that terrified her more than anything. Without another word, she turned on her heel and left. Alexander watched her go, knowing that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Luna Hayes had spent most of her life fighting for her independence. She had learned early on that if she wanted something, she had to earn it. No one was going to hand her success, and she was fine with that. Hard work, determination, and resilience, that was how she survived. But Alexander Reid had changed everything. Ever since she stormed into his office and confronted him about paying her tuition, something inside her had shifted. She told herself she was furious. She told herself she wanted nothing more to do with him. And yet, no matter how much she tried to push him from her mind, his words lingered. Now you don't have to struggle. I never expected this to change anything. She hated how much that got to her. Luna threw herself into work, hoping that the long hours would drown out the frustration brewing inside her. She kept selling water during the day and took extra shifts at the restaurant at night. The exhaustion was a welcome distraction. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself that she didn't need Alexander's help, that she didn't need him, she couldn't shake the fact that she missed their banter, their arguments, the way he looked at her as if she were someone worth noticing. And Alexander? He was struggling just as much. For the first time in years, he felt out of control. Luna wasn't like anyone he had ever dealt with. She didn't play games, she didn't manipulate, and she certainly didn't make things easy for him. He had helped people before, philanthropy was just another part of his business, but no one had ever fought him on it the way she did. The truth was, he admired her. And that was dangerous. So he did something he rarely did. He waited. Days passed, then a week, and he forced himself to stay away. He didn't call, didn't show up at her stand, didn't interfere. If she wanted space, he would give it to her. But what he didn't realize was that while he was keeping his distance, Luna was growing more and more aware of just how much his absence affected her. One evening, after an exhausting shift at the restaurant, she overheard a conversation between two coworkers. "Did you hear about the management change?" one of them said. "Apparently, the new guy's way better. The old manager got fired out of nowhere." Luna paused, her grip tightening around the tray in her hands. "You think someone reported him?" the other asked. "No idea. But whoever did, I'm not complaining. The last guy was a nightmare." A sick feeling settled in Luna's stomach. She hadn't even thought about it before, but now it was glaringly obvious. Alexander. She clenched her jaw, suddenly furious all over again. First, her tuition. Now, her job. She didn't need to be saved. She didn't need him fixing her problems behind the scenes. By the time her shift ended, her frustration had boiled over. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, but there was only one thing she knew for certain: she needed answers. And she knew exactly where to find them. When Luna arrived at Reid Enterprises, the receptionist barely had time to react before she stormed past the front desk. "Miss, do you have an appointment?" the woman called after her. "He'll see me," Luna shot back, heading straight for the elevators. By the time she reached Alexander's office, his assistant had already been alerted. But before anyone could stop her, she pushed open the large mahogany doors. Alexander was sitting behind his desk, his suit crisp, his posture composed as always. But the moment he saw her, he knew. She knew. Luna slammed the door behind her and crossed her arms. "Did you buy the restaurant?" Alexander sighed, setting down his pen. "Luna. Did you buy it?" she demanded, her voice sharp. He studied her for a long moment before answering. "Yes." Her chest tightened, anger and something she didn't want to name swelling inside her. "Why?" "I wanted to make sure you were treated fairly." Luna let out a dry laugh. "You mean you wanted to control my life?" "That's not what I—" "Yes, it is," she interrupted, stepping closer. "First my tuition, now my job. What's next? My apartment? My future? I don't need you making decisions for me, Alexander." His jaw tensed, but his voice remained calm. "I wasn't trying to control you. I was trying to help." "Well, stop," she snapped. "I don't need your help." Alexander stood then, his presence commanding as he took a step toward her. "You're right," he said. "You don't need it. But that doesn't mean you have to fight me every time someone wants to make your life easier." Luna swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "I know you're strong," he continued. "I know you can do this on your own. But just because you can doesn't mean you have to." Her breath caught in her throat. "I love you, Luna," he said, his voice softer now. "And when you love someone, you want to protect them." Her heart pounded. She should have been furious. She should have told him to go to hell. But instead, all she felt was fear. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just fighting for her independence, she was fighting against the terrifying realization that she might actually love him back. And that scared her more than anything. So instead of saying what she wanted to, instead of admitting that part of her wanted to believe him, she took a step back and whispered the words that shattered them both. "I can't do this." Alexander's expression didn't change, but she saw the flicker of pain in his eyes. She turned before he could say anything else, before she could change her mind, and walked out the door. And for the first time since meeting him, she felt truly alone. Luna Hayes had spent the past few days trying to convince herself that walking away from Alexander Reid was the right decision. She told herself that she had done what was necessary, that allowing a man like him into her life would only lead to disappointment. Yet, despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the hollow feeling that had settled deep inside her. She had expected him to call, to show up at her stand like he always did, challenging her with that maddening smirk of his. But there was nothing. No visits. No messages. The silence was deafening. But Alexander Reid was not a man who simply gave up. On a warm Friday afternoon, just as Luna was setting up her cooler for another long day, she noticed something unusual. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk across from her stand. People were laughing, whispering, taking pictures with their phones. Curious, she craned her neck to see what had captured their attention. And then she saw him. Alexander Reid, billionaire investor, powerful CEO, and the last person she expected to see standing on a street corner, was selling water. Her water. Luna blinked, convinced she was imagining things. But no, there he was, sleeves rolled up, a cooler beside him, holding up a bottle in one hand like a seasoned vendor. Cold water. $2, he called out, mimicking her usual sales pitch. Best deal in the city, hydration and charm included for free. A businessman walking by stopped, clearly recognizing him. Are you serious? Alexander didn't miss a beat. Dead serious. The man chuckled, shaking his head, but handed him $2 anyway. Alexander exchanged the money, nodded approvingly, and moved on to the next customer. Luna's stomach twisted. What the hell was he doing? She stormed across the street, pushing through the small crowd. Alexander. He turned toward her, expression calm, as if he had been expecting this reaction. Luna. She gestured wildly at the scene in front of her. What is this? Looks like I'm selling water, he said simply. Why? She demanded. He studied her for a long moment before responding. Because if I can live in your world, maybe you'll believe that you can live in mine. The words hit her harder than she expected. She stared at him, her heart pounding, not knowing whether to laugh, scream, or cry. Instead, she whispered, "You're impossible." Alexander smiled, handing her a bottle of water. "And you're stubborn." Luna exhaled sharply. "So what now?" He tilted his head slightly. "That depends on you, seller." And in that moment, Luna realized she wasn't ready to walk away from him just yet. Luna Hayes never thought a marriage proposal would come like this. She had imagined grand gestures before, maybe on the rare occasions when she let herself daydream. A candlelit dinner, a glittering diamond, the traditional moment when a man knelt down on one knee. But Alexander Reid was not a man who followed conventions. And that's why, when she arrived at the street corner where she had spent so many days selling water, she wasn't prepared for what she saw. The place looked different. Small string lights hung between lampposts, casting a soft glow over the pavement. A path of flower petals led to her old cooler, the same one she had used to carry bottles of water for years. And standing beside it, looking as composed as ever, was Alexander. Luna's breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. "What is this?" Alexander picked up a bottle of water from the cooler and held it out to her. "I had to make sure you accepted this last bottle." Luna hesitated, then took it from his hands. "Alexander, what are you?" But before she could finish, he did something she never expected. He knelt. Right there, on the sidewalk, on the very street where their story had begun. Luna's heart stopped. Alexander pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it. The ring inside was simple, not flashy or extravagant, but beautiful in its own way. He looked up at her, his expression steady. "From the day I first saw you standing here, selling water with that defiant smile, I knew my life would never be the same." Luna swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the water bottle in her hand. "You taught me that love isn't about control," he continued. "It's not about money or power. It's about choosing someone every single day. And I choose you, Luna." Her vision blurred with tears. Alexander exhaled, his voice softer now. "You once told me you didn't want to be saved. And I finally understand that. You don't need saving, you never did. But if you'll let me, I'd like to stand beside you, not in front of you." Luna felt her walls crumbling. She had spent so much of her life proving she could do things on her own. But for the first time, she realized that love wasn't about proving anything, it was about trusting someone to stand beside you, no matter what. Alexander held her gaze. "Will you spend the rest of your life with me?" Luna didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered, then laughed through her tears. "Yes, you impossible man." A rare, genuine smile crossed Alexander's face as he slid the ring onto her finger. And before he could even stand, Luna pulled him into a deep kiss, right there on the sidewalk where their journey had begun. And for the first time in her life, Luna Hayes knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Luna Hayes never imagined she would marry a man like Alexander Reid. She had spent most of her life believing she had to fight her battles alone, that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. But here she was, standing before a small gathering of friends and loved ones, her hands intertwined with the man who had changed everything. Their wedding wasn't a grand affair. There were no extravagant ballrooms, no flashing cameras, no headlines in glossy magazines. Instead, it was a simple ceremony in a quiet garden on the outskirts of the city. A place that felt real, intimate, just like them. Luna wore a dress that wasn't expensive but was perfect in its simplicity. Alexander, always the composed businessman, had abandoned his usual suit for something softer, less rigid. And as he looked at her, his blue eyes filled with something she had never seen in them before, pure, unguarded happiness. The officiant's voice was warm and steady. "Do you, Alexander Reid, take Luna Hayes to be your wife, to stand beside her through every joy and challenge life may bring?" Alexander didn't hesitate. "I do." Luna felt a lump rise in her throat as the words settled over her. "And do you, Luna Hayes, take Alexander Reid to be your husband, to walk with him as partners, as equals, for the rest of your days?" She looked up at him, remembering every moment that had led them here, the fights, the misunderstandings, the way he had challenged her, supported her, loved her. "I do." A soft breeze rustled through the trees as they exchanged rings, as Alexander's fingers brushed against hers, steady and sure. And then, with a quiet, knowing smile, he cupped her face and kissed her. It wasn't the kind of kiss meant for an audience. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was theirs, filled with years of unsaid words, of stubbornness and longing, of a love that had never followed the rules but had found its way just the same. The guests clapped, a few even whistled, but Luna barely heard them. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking about tomorrow. She wasn't worrying about survival, about proving herself, about pushing the world away. She was just here, standing beside a man who had seen her for who she truly was and had loved her anyway. And that was enough. As they walked hand in hand down the garden path, Alexander leaned in and murmured, "So, Mrs. Reid, do you still think I'm impossible?" Luna smirked, squeezing his fingers. "Absolutely." He chuckled. "Good. I wouldn't want it any other way." And with that, they stepped into their future together, Not as a billionaire and a street vendor, not as two people from different worlds, but as equals. As partners. As home. Life is a journey we cannot walk alone forever. The story of Luna and Alexander is not just about love, it is a lesson in self-respect, resilience, and the importance of accepting help when it is offered with sincerity. Luna spent her life believing she had to face every challenge alone. But true strength isn't just about independence, it's also about knowing when to let others in, when to allow someone to share the weight of life's burdens. Alexander, a man used to power and control, learned that love is not about protecting someone by making choices for them, it's about standing beside them as an equal, as a partner. In life, we often reject help because we fear losing our independence. But accepting genuine care from others is not weakness, it is an act of self-love. As we grow older, we realize that the most valuable things in life are not what we achieve alone, but the people who have stood by us through every step of our journey. True connection, understanding, and shared experiences are what make life truly meaningful.